Hello there, listeners. This is an audio recording of my book, The Westwind Tales of Sword and Sand, which is book 1 in the Westwind Tales series. If you like what you hear, consider subscribing, leaving a like or a comment, or preferably all of the above. If you want more content like this, consider supporting the channel by purchasing my book on Amazon, becoming a channel member by clicking the join button, or preferably both. So sit back, relax, grab a cup of tea, and enjoy the chapter. Chapter 9. Alde Sathermere. Upon the Southern Moor. Dawn's first light crept through the trees and fell upon Merritt's face. He had been awake for the past hour or so, listening to the elf girl who had recently gone silent. Merritt suspected that she had been unable to bear the constant pain. Eric was curled up next to him, sleeping soundly. Birds had been singing before there was light enough for Merritt to see his breath in the morning air. The silver collar was cold against his neck, and parts of his skin were frozen to the frosty metal. Sitting up, he stretched and looked about. He was surprised to find that he was surrounded by 20 other prisoners, 5 of which were wood elves. In the dark, Merritt hadn't realized there were so many. Most of them wore collars around their necks, and some were chained loosely to a long rope strung between 2 trees. Merritt figured that it was mostly for show. No prisoner with a collar around his neck could escape. It was simply a way of saying, "You belong to us. You are property." Merritt walked stiffly over to Balsa, the elf girl. She was still crouching on her knees, but her arms hung loosely at her sides. He squatted down in front of her and tried to see if she was breathing. Her brown hair hung down in front of her face, so that he was unable to determine if she was awake, let alone still living. He reached out and moved her hair. She lashed out at him with a hand, shoving his arm away from her. "Don't touch me!" she shrieked. Merritt fell startled onto his backside and sat there staring at her with wide eyes. She was definitely alive. She had deep brown eyes that bored into his own. Tear-stained and red as they were, those eyes gave her a fierce, almost noble appearance. Her mouth was small and clamped shut, and her red lips were pursed. She pushed her hair behind her pointed ears with a quick motion while glaring at Merritt intently. Merritt stared at her, slack-jawed and silent. For all her ferocity, she was still beautiful. No, beautiful was an injustice. She was stunning, easily surpassing the most bewitching woman from the Weirding Guild that he had ever laid eyes on. His mouth went dry as he tried to say something, and finally he managed, Are you all right?" Balsa twisted her lips into a sneer. "I don't need your sympathy, manling," she spat. "Go away and leave me alone." Merritt protested, stumbling to his feet, but a dangerous glare from the elf silenced him. Quickly moving out of her reach, he went back to where Sigrid and Eric lay. Sigrid, who had woken at Balsa's shout, was smiling at Merritt, and when he sat back down, she said, "Well, I see the elf girl still lives." Merritt said nothing. Next to Balsa, Sigrid seemed so ordinary. She coughed a laugh. "First time seeing a she-elf so close, eh?" Merritt only nodded. Sigrid chuckled again. "It has been said that some men lose their minds, lost in the beauty of the fayish maidens." She leaned playfully closer and whispered quietly into his ear, "It looks like it wasn't an old maid's tale." Suddenly finding his voice, Merritt answered her. "I'm not mad," he pouted. "She was just unexpectedly, He fell silent and stared at the ground. Sigrid laughed and punched him in the shoulder. He winced and looked up at her accusingly. "Oh, come off it," she said. "She would have killed you without thinking twice had you not left as quickly as you did." Merritt's eyes widened. "What?" "Think about it," said Sigrid. "She spent the night in agony. She's in no mood to deal with a fawning little boy." "Not a little boy," mumbled Merritt. "Besides," she continued, "elf women are notoriously violent, especially when they are young. Where I grew up, there's a story about an elf maiden who killed 20 men for just looking at her." Sigrid nudged him in the arm. "Now, if you want to see true fayish beauty, I hear the Duaro far surpass the elves." Sigrid continued to tease him until there was a sound from the tree line. The hunting party had returned. The group was led by Galli, and in the midst of them were 2 figures who stood out, an Olma and a man. Both wore collars. The man's hands were tied in front of him, and the Olma was shackled hand and foot. She hobbled behind him as quickly as she could manage. Sigrid gasped. "A silver-haired mage," she whispered to herself. Turning to Merritt, she whispered under her breath, "He's the last. We'll be heading to the Southlands now." Galli spoke something to an elf next to him and pointed at Merritt. Sigrid spoke again. "He probably wants you to take the collar off the mage. If what you said is true, then Galli can't control him right now with anything other than threats. He'll probably need to put the collar on him himself." The elf came marching up to Merritt and grabbed him by the arm, hoisting him up to his feet. "Come with me, boy. You're needed." Half dragging, half leading, the elf pulled Merritt over to where Galli stood. Galli, with a wide smile playing on his lips, clapped a hand onto Merritt's shoulder. "All right, lad. You're going to remove this mage's collar so that I can put it back on again." Merritt nodded. It wasn't a question. "And you, Stormhand," said Galli with a sneer, "don't get any ideas of trying to fight your way out of this. Look around you. There are 13 of us here, and all of us are competent spellweavers. Legions have fallen before 13 elves. A single human can do nothing against us." Galli shoved him toward Merritt. Merritt stood face to face with Edmund. Both of them wore collars now, and neither one spoke to the other. With shaky hands, Merritt reached up and put his fingers on the collar around Edmund's neck. As he removed it, he caught the faintest smile flit across Edmund's mouth before vanishing. Click. The collar flew from Edmund's neck and tumbled across the grass. All those standing near him were thrown back through the air, landing hard several paces away in every direction. Merritt, slightly stunned, pushed himself into a sitting position and stared at Edmund. The mage stood, perfectly calm. Raising his arms to shoulder height, he called to his magic, swirling his hands in a wide arc around him. A fierce wind began to build around him, lashing out in every direction. The elves had regained their composure, and though they were taken aback by the sudden attack, they quickly formed a circle around him. Galli stood directly in front of him and shouted over the building wind that whipped violently around them. "Drop the axe, Stormhand, or we'll be forced to put you down. We'll rip the magic out of you and leave you broken for the wolves." Edmund grinned and spoke in a voice that pierced through the howling wind. "Go ahead and try, elf." Galli screamed a command at the circle of 13 elves. All at once they began to hum, a deep, vibrating tone that pounded in Merritt's ears and made his chest ache. The hum quickly grew into a rising note of song, each elf singing in harmonic tandem with the next. Galli remained silent, standing in front of Edmund. The elf behind him placed a hand on his back. Galli raised his arms and opened his mouth. The sound that poured forth was like nothing Merritt had ever heard. It sounded elegant, ordered even, yet somehow primal. It was power in its most raw and unpredictable form. Galli whipped his arms forward, throwing all the circle's power at the mage in its center. Edmund dropped his arms to his sides, and, in a movement quicker than Merritt's eyes could follow, he closed the distance between himself and Galli, seizing him by the throat. The slaves all around Merritt gasped, and Galli gave a strangled cough, grabbing Edmund's forearms with both hands, trying in vain to pull his neck free from the iron grip. Unable to escape, Galli planted both feet wide apart and squeezed Edmund's arm as hard as he could. Opening his mouth once more, Galli screamed forth the whole power of the circle. Hair blowing wild in the face of the thunderous gale, Edmund widened his stance and leaned forward, bracing against the terrible force. His muscles tightened and his jaw clenched as he strained against the attacking elves. It was a hideous moment. A great wildfire pitted against the raging wind of 13 mighty storms. The slaves cowered together in fear. The collars around their necks rattled like scrap metal as magical energy swelled around them. Only the elf girl, Balsa, stood, her eyes fixated upon the events unfolding before her, specifically upon the man of silver, who, against all natural and logical odds, stubbornly held his own against the harmonizing elves. Her hands were clenched into fists, and her hair whipped around her face with the wind. The 4 other captive wood elves sat calmly behind the rest of the slaves. They waited patiently for the outcome they were sure would follow. No man could stand against an elf. This one faced 13. He stood no chance. Merritt was terrified. Was this the mage that he had so easily subdued only a day before? It was fortunate that he had slipped the collar around his neck when he was unconscious. Otherwise, he would have been torn apart. The standoff continued until suddenly, Edmund's expression changed. It turned from the strained grimace of a man fighting for his life to one of understanding, as though something inside of him had shifted into place. Clenching his free hand into a fist above his head, he called with a voice barely audible above the wind. "Be silent." Immediately, the rushing air that had thundered around them snapped inward to the mage's fist, replaced with a sudden, eerie hush. The mountain elves tumbled to their knees, all clutching at their throats with crazed looks upon their faces. Edmund released his grip upon Gally's neck and let the elf fall to the ground. As soon as his knees hit the dry earth beneath him, Gally began to wheeze, both hands clutching at his neck, desperately failing to suck air into his chest. The rest of the mountain elves, all coughing and gagging, began to panic. For the first time in their long lives, they were cut off from their magic. Many of the slaves around Merritt were waiting like scared rabbits for the elves to stand up again, to rise and crush the human who had opposed them. However, Merritt, having a good understanding of ley magic, realized with awe that Edmund had bested them. The moment that the elves had been blocked from their magic, the mage had won. Excitement rose in his chest. It was only a matter of moments now before he forced the mountain elves to remove the collars from the slaves. Merritt glanced over to where Sigrid was sitting, but the girl was not there. Without warning, Edmund tumbled to the ground. There, behind him, stood Sigrid. In her hands, she clutched a heavy stick. Lifting the cudgel above her head, she brought it down a second time upon the dazed mage at her feet, striking him deftly on the back of his head. He sank limply into the dirt and moved no more. As the gasping of the mountain elves tapered off, Sigrid and Merritt locked eyes for a moment, and then her gaze slipped past him to the little boy standing at his side. Darkness swirled around Edmund. He could feel it moving about like wind in the dark of night. Was this another memory? He looked about him, but saw nothing. No memory stirred in the back of his head, itching to pour forth as usual. Then he remembered what had happened. He grunted in frustration. He had been so close. It had been a long time since he had been able to use magic like he had just now. It was so freeing, so exhilarating. It had been different than he remembered it, though. Something was very strange with the magic he had used near the end. It had felt right, like he had only just figured out how to properly control it. At the beginning, though he had been so sure of his ability to overcome the elves, he had struggled to stay in control. But then, it had made sense. His magic had made sense. Something had changed. Whether it was the way he used it or the way he understood it, he couldn't say. Whatever it was that changed, forcing the elves to their knees had been easier than breathing. If he had continued, he could have forced them to remove all the slaves' collars. He had been so close. "And then Sigrid hit you," said a deep voice from the darkness. Edmund jolted out of the stupor he had sunk into. Looking around him, he tried to find the person speaking. "Who is Sigrid?" he asked, and then he shook his head. "Actually, forget that question. Who are you?" The voice answered from the darkness. "Sigrid is the young woman who stopped you from destroying those 13 elves, who were fool enough to try and subdue you through ley magic. She thought she was protecting her boy, of course. You mustn't hold it against her. As for me, I am called many things, but I much prefer my given name, that is, Valhurst. You and I have quite the long history together, my dear brother." "You're my brother?" asked Edmund excitedly. "Adopted brother, actually. You're a good deal, older than I am." Edmund ceased looking around and stood still. "I'm sorry, I'm afraid I don't remember you. You see, I lost—" Yes, you lost your memory," interrupted Valhurst. "You lost it because our dear Lady of Shadow, Tiamar, was forced to cast a spell upon you to erase your memory for the time being. She figured that you would realize what kind of spell it was, and therefore not let it touch you. Unfortunately, what the Raven Queen did not realize was just how much you trusted her. You didn't even inspect the spell form before it reached you. You simply recognized her magic and let it take root. It was that trust of yours that got you into this mess. However, as soon as she realized what she had done, she appeared to me and told me everything. Of course, I had seen it all happen, but I indulged her and listened. Regardless, I am here now, if not physically, and I bring you this message. Come to the foot of the Crown Atlas, above the Northlands. There you will find a guide who will bring you to me. When you are here, I will remove that pesky spell from your brain so that you may remember everything again." Edmund stood in silence. He could remember everything? The White Mountain Range ran along the northern border of the Northlands, perpendicular to the Western Sea. At the peak of that range stood the tallest peak in all of Jordan, the Crown Atlas. The mountain was so high that, for all intents and purposes, the top of the mountain was never truly visible. It was always shrouded in clouds that fanned out from its peak like a cap of a mushroom. In some of the older historical documents, it was referred to as the foundation of the skies. At the foot of that great mountain, there was a small outpost of farmers, trappers, and woodsmen who lived in its shadow, Idlewind. Edmund was sure to find the guide there. "Can you get me away from these slavers?" asked Edmund hopefully. "By the time I wake up, they'll have that hammer-damned collar around my neck again. And it doesn't matter how strong I am. With that horrid thing on me, I can't so much as look at my magic without it biting me." Valhurst answered with a curious chuckle. "Hammer-damned. An interesting choice of words for you. But unfortunately, no, I can't help you there. I am restrained at the moment. I have problems of my own. You are not the only one to be attacked in such a dishonorable fashion. Besides, even if I could come down there to where you are and rescue you, I wouldn't. Father has told me not to. He has business for you in the Southlands. Something about a Masa'ad. You'll have to figure it out for yourself." He paused for a moment. "Oh, and Eslinweir, don't get yourself killed. That tends to ruin things." Before Edmund could protest, the darkness began to fade, and pain seeped into the back of his head. He began to wake up. Blinding light poured into Edmund's eyes. Someone was carrying him on their back like a child. Once his eyes adjusted to the light, he realized, by the hawk feather earring tickling his nose, that it was Willow. All around him, slaves were trudging, heads down, eyes sullen. He began to groan at the pain in his head, but was immediately met with a hushed warning. "Be silent, River. Don't move," said Willow, without turning her head to look at him. Edmund obeyed her command without question. He could guess why. A band of slavers wouldn't let a slave pull what he had without punishment. They were likely waiting until he woke up so that they could make an example out of him in front of the others. Edmund quickly closed his eyes and feigned unconsciousness. Willow continued to speak, quietly under her breath. "We're moving south and east. I heard the Fjorkirs mention a pass in the mountains that leads into the Southlands." "Trader's Pass," whispered Edmund in Willow's ear. "It's an abandoned military outpost in the western Lumbars. The mountain elves used it during the border war to escape into the Southlands. It's the only path through the mountains this far west. Otherwise, you have to walk all the way to the Eastlands to get around them." "Willow, how long have I been unconscious?" "You've been out for 2 days. Sigrid must have quite the arm to put you out for so long." Willow gave a quiet laugh. 2 days?" asked Edmund. "She didn't hit me that hard. I had some sort of vision while I was out. Perhaps that was responsible. Either way, have we been marching the whole time?" Willow nodded her head slightly and grunted. "Ugh," and then added, "And the terrain has been slanting upward the last few hours. I believe we're entering the foothills of the Lumbar Range." Edmund could hear the subtle hint of dread in her voice. The southern moors. He shuddered a little. The last time he had set foot there was a long time ago. Though there was an abundance of wild game to be found in the foothills, no people ventured out onto the moors. It was the hunting ground of the Gavader. A sinking feeling crept into Edmund's bones. He snuck a glance at the slaves around him. Beneath each downcast gaze was a layer of fear. Most Northlanders had grown up, hearing stories of the laughing wolves. The Gavader had come up from the Southlands, through Trader's Pass, in the Fourth Era, long before the Border War. Before there was even an outpost there. They had been driven out of their territory by Southland tribes, up into the Lumbar Mountains. The weak and small had died in the cold, harsh terrain. Only the strong made it through to the rich hunting grounds on the other side. There they grew stronger and larger. Any people living on the moors either left or were killed by the roving packs. Edmund had braved the moors once, and the Gavader had hounded him the moment he set foot within their territory. Edmund hadn't slept the whole way through. Each night was spent within a circle of fire that he kept lit with his magic through the long hours of the darkness. He remembered that exhausting journey well. He remembered the howling and the inhuman, throaty laughter from only feet away. separated from him by only a few inches of blazing fire. What made the Gavader truly terrifying, however, was their resistance to magic. No trick would throw them off the scent once they caught it. No spell would scare them off. His fire had barely kept them at bay during those sleepless nights. The more he used magic to fend them off, the more Edmund got the impression that the Gavader were actually drawn to it. It was as if they could smell it. Edmund glanced over on the other side of Willow's Head. The elves were walking just ahead of the group of slaves. One of them looked back at the same moment. They locked eyes. "Hey, Gally, he's awake," called the elf without looking away. "Is he, Rel?" answered Gally from the front of the group. "About rutting time. Everybody stop." Well, that wraps up part 1. Make sure you tune in for part 2 later this week. And in the meantime, leave a comment and a like. If you can't wait for part 2, then you can head on over to Amazon and purchase the full-length book there. Or you can click on the link down below. I'll see you all next time, but until then, enjoy the adventure.